Plato's classic allegory of the cave begins with the description of folks in a deep recess of a cave. The people are bound and incapable of looking anywhere but straight ahead. Behind them is a wall, and high behind that, a fire. Passing between the wall and the fire, there are objects that are held aloft and cast shadows. The imprisoned think they're seeing the world, but they are only seeing distorted shadows cast by others. Each person chained, both physically and mentally, by iron-clad shackles. According to Plato, for the prisoners to see the world as it really is, they'd have to be freed from their bondage, led/dragged up the wall of the cave, and into the blinding light of day. Freedom, it seems, is possible, though maybe not probable. But I wonder about the folks in the cave. I wonder if there are those who see freedom as a threat. Perhaps they'd rather suffer the world as they know it, deny their human need to question and learn, choose to stay safe in their known prison, accept their blinders and misled truths as a price worth paying to avoid the pain of exposure. I also wonder if there are others for whom the potential risks are nothing compared to the burning in their souls for a taste of freedom. The people who dream in technicolor and refuse to live their one wild and precious life, chained to the lies of the corruptive status quo. Those compelled by a consuming fire in their hearts to want for more than a life lived in the shadows. You see, this is the real kicker of Plato's allegory: choice. Will the shackled choose to remain, or will they choose freedom? Will they choose conformity, or will they choose to risk it all to find liberation for their full self? Plato wrote this allegory as a way to examine the liberatory stages of knowledge, because he knew how powerful knowledge is, how dangerous and risky it is to learn. Because when one starts to learn, one also begins to question. And when a soul begins to question the world around it, there is simply no going back to the way things were. The unknown author of the letter of the Hebrews also understood the importance of knowledge. Within the text I read earlier, the author is reminding their listeners of their own history, a mountain that they could touch that caused fear and trembling, versus the kingdom and the Mount Zion, the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, the innumerable angels, and a kingdom that cannot be shaken. Let us give thanks, for indeed our God is a consuming fire. All throughout this ancient letter, the author is pleading with their people to hold fast to their history. Remember Abraham, Sarah, Rebecca, Isaac, Jacob, Rachel, Leah, Esau, Miriam. Remember the cloud of witnesses of all of those who have come before you, who now surround you. Remember the mountain where the Lord of hosts first spoke to Moses and how it made those men tremble. Remember Esau, who sold his birthright, his very identity, for a cup of soup. Remember Leah, sold into marriage by a manipulative father to a man that she didn't even love. Remember Hagar, an enslaved woman sexually exploited by her masters, but who ultimately was the first one in our ancient text to name God, El Rio, the God who sees me. Listen to these stories. Know the history, remove the shackles, trust the hand that seeks to guide you, leave the cave and stand in the light of day. Receive a kingdom that cannot be shaken. Answer the call within you to see and taste that the Lord is good, for indeed our God is a consuming fire. Knowledge, power, choice. The first time the word homosexual appeared in any Bible was in the Revised Standard Version published on February 11th, 1946. In the RSV's translation of 1 Corinthians 6:9, the word homosexual was used in lieu of Greek words like malakoi and the arsenikatoia, which I always mess up saying, so we can ask our Greek professional and Professor Natalie for clarification on that. But researchers agreed today that these words translate loosely to pervert or sexual perversion. The decision to use the word homosexual instead of the accurate translations was voted on by the RSV committee. There are researchers, Kathy Baldock and Ed Oxford, who have dedicated their lives to researching the roots of anti-gay theology. As part of their extensive research, they uncovered 90 boxes of notes from the archives at Yale University. Filed in these boxes for over 5 decades was a letter sent to the RSV Translation Committee written by a young seminarian named David S. In the letter, David points out the dangerous implications that could come with the mistranslation and misuse of the word homosexual. The head of the Translation Committee, Dr. Luther Weigel, wrote a letter back to David S. to acknowledge their mistake and commit to correcting their grave error. Unfortunately, such corrections was not available until 1971, 25 years after the mistranslation occurred. By then, other translations of the Bible had applied the RSV's use of homosexual in all forms of biblical texts. This became the foundation for much of the anti-gay theology and culture that exists today, especially in religious spaces. Many conservative religious leaders have used these biblical texts to condone and marginalize queer Christians, and society as a large has been shaped to believe that the idea of sexual and gender minorities must choose between their faith and their identity. But I'm here to ask the question, why? Why was a word that referred to events related to some form of pedophilia or abuse tied to queer people? Why, when we know in the Greco-Roman times the condemnation of same-gendered behavior was primarily regarding abusive sexual acts between adult men and children, young boys? Paul, who was condemning the use of power for abusive purposes, was actually trying to teach and listen and hear about how we need to understand that the sexual exploitation found in these relationships were rooted in patriarchal pedophilia and had nothing to do with queer love between consenting adult partners. Also, it sure is strange that such a translation took over all biblical translations by the year 1968. Which only enforce division and violence amongst Americans, speaking within our own context. Which also happened to be right in the middle of the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement. And isn't it also coincidence that only 6 years after the RSV's blessing of targeting queer people, the American Psychiatric Association Diagnostic Manual listed homosexual behavior as sociopathic personality disorder? Or how just a year after the American Psychological Association's new manual was released, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed an executive order that banned homosexuals from working for the federal government, saying that they were, quote, a security risk. And it sure is strange that the queer community of that time was harassed, targeted, and violated by police at the only places they could safely gather: underground queer bars. Patrons who were racially diverse and spanned the gender expression spectrum routinely brought in their own clothes to dress and express themselves freely, to enter into that space and step into their true selves. For them, the dingy and dark bars reminiscent of Plato's cave became neon cathedrals with a beer-stained altar and a rowdy bartender turned priest serving communion shots to everyone. Oh, and why were the bars routinely raided by the police? Well, that's because those bars were funded by the only organization willing to turn a blind eye to the illegality of the patrons, the mafia. Here's some trivia rule for you. What does the mafia and the queer have in common? A lot, actually. But why does all this matter? Because on June 28, 1969, as the police raided historic Stonewall Inn, the queer family was left with a choice. Accept the violence going against them, or remove their shackles. Stand tall in their truth, or cower in fear from violence done to their persons. And like the opening shot at the battles of Lexington and Concord in 1775, a thrown shot glass shattered the palpable tension at the Stonewall, leading to a week of rioting and the revolutionary birth of queer liberation as we know it. And for that, and so much more, we gather in this sacred place to pay respect to the legacy of our queer ancestors who've come before us. For them, we draw the circle wide. For them, we celebrate the beautiful colors of a diverse rainbow. For Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, Harvey Milk, Alan Schneider, Brandon Tina, Matthew Shepard, Jason Gage, the 49 murdered at Pulse nightclub, and the thousands of lives who have been taken or conformed and pressed and hidden away, for all of that we gather to remember, to celebrate, to choose. Knowledge, power, choice. Listen to these stories. Know our history. Remove shackles. Trust the hand that seeks to guide you. Scrap, pull, drag, and strain every bit of yourself to leave the cave that is holding you back. The good news of the gospel is that there is light to stand in. And we, through a compelling, consuming fire burning deep within us from a God who sees beyond our own bigotry and hatred, is begging you to receive a kingdom that cannot be shaken. One that is so much bigger, brighter, colorful, diverse. One that is willing to take all the risks and all the costs for liberation of all people. Answer this call that is within you. See and taste that the Lord is good, for indeed our God is a consuming fire. Beloveds, we stand here today to proudly proclaim that we do not accept the lies cast by distorted agendas of hate or bigotry. We, as a faith community and as unbound people, refuse to shackle ourselves to the shadows. We who know the truth that our God is a consuming fire, compelling us towards love, justice, and respect of all human dignity, stand firmly beside a queer legacy of inclusion, revolution, and resistance. This is our calling. So to the world frozen by hate, this is your warning. We are here. We are queer, and we are compelled by a burning love that will never cease to blaze. We are University Baptist Church. We are rooted in faith older than your hate. We are progressive in action, spurred on by love that you cannot dictate, and we will not go quietly into the night. For we know, and we celebrate, and we include, and we march, and we vote, and we fight, and we love. And indeed, we truly know that a kingdom that cannot be shaken is ours. That a God who is a consuming fire is with us. And we are not afraid. Amen.